Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Dawn Dole, and I'm the Executive Director for the Taos Institute. The Taos Institute is a nonprofit organization that focuses on educational opportunities that look at and advance social constructionist ideas and practice. And social construction theory and practice locates the source of meaning and value and action in the relational connection among people. And it is through the social and the relational processes that we construct our world together. So we look at ways that we bring practitioners and academics together to explore and learn and create new opportunities and new practices. We have conferences, we have workshops, we have publications, we have a certificate program, a diploma program, newsletter, lots of free resources on our website. So I invite you all to take some time and look at our website after the call today. We offer these monthly dialogues with the authors. And today I want to welcome Madelyn Blair, our author of the month this month. She is president of Pelerei Incorporated, a firm dedicated to helping clients turn vision into reality. She's a facilitator, a designer of learning experiences, a researcher, and an author. And Madelyn, thank you so much for being with us today. I would like to turn the call over to you now.
Thank you, Dawn. And thank you to everyone who has joined. I'm actually delighted that the number is small because I like to be in interaction. To me, when I heard dialogue with the author, I really thought of this as a conversation. But if it gets too big, then I'll shift over to more presentation. Yeah, we're going to do some chatting through the chat box. I'm going to ask you some questions. We're also going to use some small groups. So I'll give you some questions to explore. And as Dawn has indicated, this is a 90-minute activity, and I very much appreciate that you're going to give me that much time. I will, on my part, keep my end short so that you have an opportunity to express yourselves. I'm going to go through some presentation files, and I'm not going to do it in presentation mode. I'm going to do it, you'll see it as a working document. So you'll notice that I will skip some slides. I'll do that for the sake of time. This is actually designed as a full 90-minute presentation. I don't want it to be that for today. And I want you to ask questions for sure. You can ask them through the chat window, and then if it keeps open, we may do it dynamically, but we'll let that happen later, or decide that later. What I'd like to ask you each to do now is, and since we're such a small group, I really would like to do it in plenary. I'd like you to introduce yourself, just your name, and say what question would you like to have answered today during this conversation. And to start that off, I will tell you my question. My question is, how would you translate the 5 practices that I'll be talking about into an organizational setting? Sally, are you ready to begin?
Sure. The question that piqued my interest reading was about the storytelling, about writing your own personal story. And it seems to me that you were suggesting that as kind of a daily practice, almost a journaling daily practice. And I've done a lot of journaling. I've done a lot of gratitude journaling, and it does border on story. Of course, you tell stories. I mean, when I go back through my gratitude journal, I see a story of my life, the things that I loved doing, you know, the people I was happy to see, you know, things like that. But I'm wondering at the at the purpose of such is it you talk about it in your book, but is it to capture your life? Is it to understand your life? Is
Okay.
it, I
Got
like
it.
it, but yeah.
Good. Thank you. Who's next? Jeannie, are you ready? You'll have to put yourself off of mute.
Yes, sort of ready. A little bit sleepy, but I'm still, I'm ready. I'm Jeannie from Victoria, BC, Canada. I really enjoyed the book, and I guess my question is just, what was your favorite part of writing this book? What really just, you said, I can hardly wait to get back to my computer to keep on going on there, right there.
Wonderful question.
Being an author myself, it's something I'm really interested in. How do I keep that energy going?
Yeah, it's sort of like.
How did you do that?
Yeah. Okay. Joan, you're next on my screen. Unmute yourself.
Good morning. I'm Joan. I'm also from Victoria, British Columbia. I think I'm always interested in your thinking as you begin to choose and define certain kinds of words. Like those kinds of words as authors that we try to give definition to in order for our reader to attach to something, like persistence or optimism. And I know that, having read quite a bit of your writing, that you always kind of try and parse that space to then allow the reader an ability to move on, to apply it in some way, not to get stuck in that resonance of the definition. So I'm always interested in your thinking as you do that. I know some of it's based on your research and other things, but I'm interested in kind of the personal evolution of the choices you're making around how you parse those words.
Fantastic. Thank you. Alfredo?
Hi, this is Alfredo from Mexico. I'm actually in Guadalajara, which is the second largest city of the country. And very happy to be with you today. And my question, since I have not read your book yet, but my question is, how would you approach the sense or meaning of life and sense or meaning in work? That would be my question.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Nothing mild about these questions. Anne-Marie, you're next on my screen.
Hi, I'm Anne Marie. I am based out of Kitchener-Waterloo. The question I had is not so much a question, but I'm curious around the practices. I have not read the book either. I was a client forwarded this to me, and I was curious around the invitation, so thought it would be worthwhile to learn some more.
Okay, I'm not sure I caught the question. Could you say it again?
It's curiosity around the 5 practices.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Alan, I think you're next on my screen.
Hi, good morning. Alan Moore, I'm in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. So I work as both an executive coach and an organizational consultant. I'm intrigued by your definition of resilience and how you see that both at an individual level and an organizational level. What's the interplay between those? In my own kids, of course, the thing is, where do they get that grit and resilience from if they don't have any? How do we build that in people, or is it innate?
Great, thank you. Pamela, you're last on my screen.
Hi, hold on.
You're here, I hear you.
Okay, hi. So I haven't read the book either, but I'm curious. I bought it, I've ordered it. In part because of this series. I guess I would echo the last question that was offered by Alan. That struck with me as well.
Excellent. All right. Well, because of your questions, I'm going to modify how I do today, but that's okay. That's exactly what I wanted. So at least we'll get to these questions as well as some of the things that I really think would be important for us to talk about. I think I'm actually going to begin with I'll begin with why I wrote this and how I got started on all this. I have to say that my serious work on resilience began the morning I tripped on a sidewalk, fell on my chin, gave myself a concussion, and had to spend 4 days in recovery. Because that day, I made the wrong decision. I got up off the sidewalk, not knowing I had a concussion, went in and taught for 4 hours, and kept wondering why I couldn't find words that I knew. And I realized afterwards the power of the words of Viktor Frankl, who said, between stimulus and response, there is a space. And in that space lies our power to choose our response. And I said, okay, Madelyn, you had the stimulus, and your response was to get up and go, not let those students be disappointed. And in the process, could have really seriously hurt yourself. I said, I have to work on that. And when I thought more about it, I realized that space is precisely where resilience lies. So just keep that in mind as I'm going to share my screen and talk a little bit about why we need resilience in our lives, or might need resilience in our lives. I just have to catch the right one. There are times, and what I'd like to ask you to do is, we're going through this list, if one of them really feels like, I relate to this, note it in the chat if you would, and then we'll have a better sense of things. You know what? My chat window just went away. I guess because I'm sharing. All right, we'll get that back when I stop sharing. So obviously there are times when we're in transition, when you're at a stage in your career and you wish to shift. It could also be a self-development. Maybe you just sold your company and you decided that you have the economic luxury to take time to do something outside the norm. Maybe it's time for family, to have a child perhaps, or perhaps to take care of a sick parent, or perhaps you're the sick person. Maybe it's changing job demands. You've been doing a job for 30 years and suddenly technology has taken over where you go. I love the next one, which is retirement, because many people who are facing retirement say, no, I'm not going to retire. And what do you do then? It could be that you make a decision around serious education. You know that you've capped off in your career, and without an advanced degree, you can't move forward. But at the same time, you're trying to decide what to do next. Or it could be those totally unexpected things that happen in the middle of the day, everything from falling on the sidewalk, and this has happened to me, the oven stops working at 7 a.m. on Thanksgiving morning. Now in America, that's a big deal because you're always roasting a turkey that morning, or something else. So those are a lot of reasons why we feel the need to be sure that we have resilience. I'm going to stop sharing my screen because I want to see the chat to see if there's anything. Change job demands, absolutely. Yep. Okay. Good. Good. All right. With that in mind, I want to come back to this definition of resilience, because this is a definition that I feel quite committed to, and it makes it possible. It makes it possible to really take action. Oftentimes people think of resilience as being that wonderful positive feeling that, oh, you can do it and you just keep on going. it's much more than that, because you want to make the right decision or a decision so that you can move on. And that's why when I focus my work, I really look at the aspect of choice and decision. And there was recently a book published called The Finnish Way. And I don't know if you've read that book or not, but it's a great little book. And a woman went to Finland to live for a while, and she realized that the Finnish people really believe in putting themselves into uncomfortable positions so that they are accustomed to feeling comfortable in those uncomfortable positions. And I think this is what resilience is about. It's developing within yourself the ability to sit in that discomfort without getting blown away, to actually be able to make good decisions. So that's my definition. And all of my work on resilience focuses right there on the decision point. Let me stop sharing a moment. There's a story in the book about a moment when I walked into a different class this time. Having just arrived in New York City, I teach at Columbia occasionally. And I walked into the classroom and realized I didn't have my handbag with me. And I had just come off the train, had taken a taxi to the hotel, and then ran over to the class. And now that's another moment of extreme feelings. And I was in total panic because not only were my credit cards there and my cash I wasn't worried about. I never carry a lot of cash, but my passport was in there. And the story I relate in the book is how slowly I went from that incredibly high anxiety moment and gave myself actions that slowly brought that down until finally I went to the security office at the university. They said, well, the first thing we need to do is have you inventory what's in your bag. And as soon as I started inventorying what was in the bag, I realized I had taken something out of it in the hotel room. And all of a sudden I went to complete relief. So those are real moments. There's real emotion. It really is uncomfortable. Back over here. I'm sorry this is so complicated. I like to do this more simply, but I prepared one way and then things change, but that happens. But I'll be as smooth as I can.
That's because you're very resilient, Madelyn.
Thank you. Whoever said that, thank you. Okay, so let's get into some of the practices. And the first practice that I talk about is called silence. I tell people and these are just, no, I'll come back to that. Take 5 minutes each day, just 5 minutes, and sit in silence. Now, I will tell you that many professionals have a sudden anxiety on their face. Like, how can I take 5 minutes to sit in silence and do nothing? And I said, well, A, you're not doing nothing. But B, it's only 5 minutes. And if you have a phone, you just set the timer for 5 minutes and you don't worry about slipping into more time. Now, what's happening in those 5 minutes is that you give your executive brain permission to quiet. And when your executive brain, that frontal part of your brain that's very busy, always talking to you, it gives it a chance to just sort of take a breath. And what's called the default network starts working. It says, oh, you're going to listen to me now. And this is the part of the brain that just takes all kinds of crazy combinations of ideas and puts them together and comes up with new insights. To me, that's the place where when we're learning, we're integrating what we're learning into our minds. And if you give yourself only 5 minutes, it doesn't sound like very much. And yet I discovered that in my practice, and that's one practice that I always do, I come up with all kinds of ideas for a new a new blog, say, or a new idea, a new product idea. It turns out to be one of the most productive things I do all day. So it's called the practice of silence. Now, I've translated that into lots of ways to do it in organizational settings. For example, you would never ask people to sit for 5 minutes in silence in a meeting. But what you might do is send out questions ahead of time and say that in this meeting, we're going to be discussing these 3 questions. Would you think about those before you come to the meeting? It's remarkable how more productive the meeting can become. It's using one of these simple practices. The next one is an area that you asked about in specific, and that is this business of the storytelling. And I'd like to ask you to do, oops, there we go. I'd like to ask you to do the following, and I'm going to ask you to do this silently. What stories from childhood stand out for you? And what makes that story so memorable? When I thought about these questions, I realized that one of the stories in my life, and it's just a childhood story, and that is, it's called the Little Match Girl. Now, if you remember the stories, the fairy tales, the little match girl at the very end dies. But when she dies, she goes to heaven and her grandmother welcomes her into heaven. Now, what makes it memorable to me is that my grandmother was that kind of grandmother. I just knew as a child that if I died, my grandmother would make certain that she would be there waiting for me. And it gave me enormous faith, not necessarily in heaven, but faith in my family. And this is part of who I am today, with enormous trust and faith in my family. It's a very empowering place to be. So I hope at this point you might have connected with one of your childhood stories and maybe begin to get a sense of how it has formed you. Because Paul Costello, who actually is one of the associates, although not very active, is probably one of the most knowledgeable in narrative practice. And he says that stories form us as well as inform us. And so the more we write our own stories, the more we see what has formed us. And I love the quote from Camus, who says, "In the depth of winter, I finally learned that within me there lay an invincible summer." So to answer that question about what the purpose is and how does it link to journaling and what was the other one, gratitude writings, they're all of a similar vein. I just happened to come out of the storytelling area, shall we say. And so for me, it was the very natural thing to do a story. Stories have a way of bringing the past into the present so that you can then open it up and examine it. What does it mean to you? Okay. Yeah. So I say, write a story every day. I have to admit, I did it for 5 years and now I don't do it as often. But what I do is I go back and I read some of the stories I wrote several years ago and I go, oh my goodness, did I really do that? And then what did I learn from it? The key, I find, is that you have to write it down either by hand or on your computer because you want to have that record. Okay. The next practice, the third practice, I call social. By the way, I refer to these practices as the phenomenal 4+1. And there's a story there, which is that when I did my initial research, I had 4 practices. And I realized that I had made an assumption in my work. And So I realized I needed a 5th practice. So I called it the Phenomenal 4+1. And social was the one that got added back in, because it turned out the people that I was interviewing, we never talked about their social networks. But in fact, they had very rich social networks that supported them. So social is the next one. And here, the challenge is bringing the right team to support you. Isaac Newton said, "I have seen further, and it is by standing on the shoulders of giants." I loved that quote. I mean, Isaac Newton was a pretty cool dude, apparently. And I remember myself going to a conference one time where the first introduction was to have everybody think about the shoulders that they were standing on. And as I looked around the room, I didn't see a dry eye in the room as we began to realize how much we depend on that. Now, there's a lot to be said about what to do for the social. And I think I'll share screen very quickly and just go through a couple. Oops, I've been on the screen, haven't I? You have to tell me if I stay on the screen, but this is what I'm looking for, the social, the gather support. I introduce four types of social support. One is the accompanier, which is a person who can give you the bigger picture. A practice partner is somebody who asks questions of you, keeps pummeling at you to make you think more clearly. I love my practice partner because that person asks me so many questions, I sometimes encounter an assumption. And then I can suddenly test and see if that assumption is true or not. And I learn a great deal. A buddy, of course, is just somebody who supports you and keeps you accountable. But the community is another one. And this community is an example of what I mean by social support as well. One of the people that I interviewed for actually both of my books, Writing the Current was the earlier one, was Bob Sadler, because he had such an extraordinary way of bringing social support to his work. He had a vast network that he had developed over the years that he called regularly. But then he related how he translated that into a business problem where he was going to a client that wanted him to teach scientists to become leaders. And he realized there was no way you could do that cognitively. They had to experience it. And so he brought actors in, and they became the social support to those scientists so that they could experience in improv what it felt like to be a leader. And he said it was wildly successful. So there are all kinds of ways in which you can reach out. Let's see if I can find another. No, that was it. That was it. Okay. Let's see. I'm still sharing, aren't I? No, I'm not sharing now, am I? Dawn, could you tell me if I'm sharing, because I can't tell? I'm not. Thank you. That's all I need. All right. Let's go to the next one. Bear with me just a moment. I think I have skipped something, and I don't want to skip it. But maybe I have. All right. The fourth practice is called seeking. So far we have silence, story, social, and now seeking. Because when I talked to people who were really resilient, I mean, these were people who had reinvented themselves, they were very successful, and I looked at them as a group and what characterized them that made them different than the broader population. And they had three characteristics. One was that they knew who they were. They knew who they were. The second was that they had in-depth knowledge in something. And the third was that they were insatiably curious. Those three qualities are qualities that all of us can develop. And by the way, one of the questions was I can't remember how you said it, but it was, are we born with it, or can we develop it? And the point is, the fact is, we are born resilient. human beings are a resilient species. I think sometimes our socialization kind of dampens it a bit. But we can indeed build our resilience back up. The psychologists agree. This is one area you can do it yourself. And to me, these three qualities, as you build them, are what happens. Now we come to seeking. And this, I'll share this with you because I think this is just a cool picture, if nothing else. It's actually one of my favorite pictures from NASA. It's and when we really push and keep asking questions, creativity arises from that. So we can seek knowledge from others because it's really all about relationships, but it's also about choice. We choose to do it. It's also about being present. Especially when we're in the virtual world. How do we stay really present to the people who are just on our screen? And to me, a lot of that has to do with being genuine, being who you are as much as possible, mistakes and all. It helps people to then relate to you. So you have to choose to join, and I think you also have to choose to stay with a group, especially when it's virtual. Oh, I see there are chats coming in now. So let's see if I can make that happen. Nope, I can't. I'll have to come out of sharing mode to see them.
Madeline, it says, could you repeat the 3 competencies
Got it.
for the 4 practices?
The 3 competencies are that they knew who they were. The second was that they had in-depth knowledge in some area. And the third is that they were insatiably curious. Now, the 5 practices that I give they are not one for one. I'm going to eventually show you a table that will show you how they relate. They're not one for one. Okay. Thank you, Dawn, for helping me on that. All right, I do have a question for you now. And that is, we often think of this social support as being affirming and helpful, and yet sometimes we learn best from an enemy. I wonder if you would just take a minute and think about a time. Dawn, do we want to try small groups, or do you think Pelerei would work well here?
I think it's okay to stay together. If you would
Okay.
like people to just jump in, I think that's
Sure.
fine.
So I'll give you a little story about this. My daughter lives in Alaska, and she was trying a whole new industry for herself. She became a massage therapist. She loves it. She's very good at it. But she discovered that every time she would get a new job, somehow or other within a week or so, they were somehow hinting that she should leave. She couldn't figure this out. And this happened several times. And then she began to make a correlation in her mind that one of her friends was following her and telling her new employers things that were not true. And she learned from what she thought was a friend, turned out to be a real enemy, that sometimes you have to not share what's happening. And so she tested it by not telling her friend where she was, her new jobs, etc. And now she's had no difficulty staying where she's being employed. So there was a case where she learned a really big lesson from an enemy. So any thoughts on this? Sally.
Yeah, in Buddhist teachings, I'm thinking particularly of the Lojong training. They talk about, Atisha, who originated it, talks about that those who wish us harm are our greatest teachers, and that they are precious jewels and our greatest treasure. and that we must treat them as our greatest treasure. Which is, you know, mostly beyond my daily comprehension. You know, so just saying that that's not an easy one to really integrate.
Yeah.
But it is, I've never forgotten it and go back to it a lot.
Yeah. Anybody else want to share? It's a tough one. I know it's a tough question. All right, we'll move on. I was talking about curiosity and learning, and let me share again. And one of the things that I realized was that when a child is playing, they're very focused. They're also fearless. And because of that combination of being focused and fearless, they're very open to learn. A child in play is always learning. And I thought about that and I said, well, could that be possible? That we as adults could find ourselves in those moments. And I personally live on a farm, and there are a lot of trees around, and every now and then we have to have the tree surgeon come in to take some down because they get too big. And one day John came and he brought an apprentice with him. And I just happened to have my door open when this happened. He let the apprentice take down a very large limb. Now, for those of you who have dealt with trees, you know that when you cut them down, this is a big deal. You have to be very careful because you can destroy buildings, you can destroy lives. And his apprentice cut this big limb down and it hit the ground. And John said to him, you know, I wouldn't have done it quite like that, but it landed where we had planned it to land. And I looked over at the apprentice and he was beaming. You know, here was his master telling him he hadn't done it quite right, but at the same time, doing it so gently, he could take pride in his accomplishment. And I thought about that and I said, you know, they probably thought they were working. What I saw was play because they were focused and they were fearless. And so they were able to learn and the apprentice was able to learn. That one, I know that sounds like a kind of a unique example of an apprentice and the master learning a trade, but I think this can exist in professional work as well. When you work with someone who lifts you at the same time as they are correcting you, it makes a real difference. I don't know if any of you are teachers, but I can tell you that my students are always learning, and yet I'm always critiquing them because I try to do it as affirmatively as I can. That's the only thing I can say. Okay, so insatiably curious is that other one. And what do you do for that practice? This practice is to pose a question each day. And when possible, sit in ambiguity for as long as you can stand it. Because this is the place where you'll build and nurture your curiosity. And we can nurture our curiosity simply by asking questions, by being observant, and seeing what piques our curiosity. And now for the last one. The fifth practice is the practice of selecting. Every day, you begin the day by asking, what is the most important thing for me to do? Now, I don't know about you, but for me to ask myself, what's the most important thing for me to do today is actually very hard because I'm a person who has many projects. That's just how I work. And so I have a lot of things to do. And it's not just priorities. It's thinking about all the factors that are at play to finally decide the thing that is most important. Now, I'm also a list person. And when I write my lists, they can sometimes be 3 pages long. And I finally decided, okay, Madelyn, if you're telling people they should decide on the most important thing and do it, you need to do it as well. So I started each day with what's the most important thing. And a funny thing happened as I was doing that and practicing that. I found that my list that I would write for that day, not my big 3-page one, would have maybe 3 things on it. And after a few days of this, I said, wait a minute, I may be missing some things on my original lists. And I went back and I looked at the lists, and lo and behold, they were getting done. I can't tell you why or how that all happened, but now I never have my long lists. If my list has more than 3 items on it, I get nervous. And yet I'm getting tremendous amounts done. So it's a question of selection. Now, let me do one more thing. Where is it? Where is it? There. Oh, no, that's not it. I want you to do a little practice on this. I think this is it. Oh, this is it. Yes. Here are some scenarios to help us get really into this business of selecting the most important thing to do next. Pick one of those scenarios. Scenario 1, you're rushing out the door and you remember something that needs to be done before leaving the house, which may make you late. Scenario 2, invited to have a drink with the team, but your partner says, meet me at the hospital because I want to go to this friend who's just had surgery. And there are 2 more. So pick one of those scenarios. And Dawn, I think this one really would be helpful to put us into maybe 2 groups. And we'll give you 5 minutes to just tussle with that and say, what are the factors here? Make a decision.
All right. I'm going to put the recording on pause then. All right, we are back, and Madelyn, you're on mute. So Madelyn, do you want to take over again?
Thank you, Dawn. I really appreciate that. That was a wonderful discussion in my little group. I wonder if from the other 2 groups, you might get just a few sentences of what you discovered and explored. Now, I know there were 2 other groups. Somebody has to be willing.
I'll speak for our group. Well, first of all, Joan and I, who are just, in the same building, in the same home, in our different offices, got paired with a triad with Linda, who's just across the pond. We're on Vancouver Island, and she's on the mainland in Vancouver, and we're Victoria. So that was kind of fun. Connect to a neighbor. And we explored the one about rushing out of the house. So we were saying, we need to make some choices about the importance of all aspects of that. If the house was going to burn down if we didn't do this thing, then it would be important to be late for the meeting rather than to rush off and let the house burn down, and vice versa. If it was something mundane or whatever, we thought it was just on our list, but it was a really important relationship building to go off into the meeting. Of course, we'd go and rush off and leave the other thing not done. So I think that was it in a nutshell. Mm-hmm. Linda and Joan?
I'm not sure I'd add much to that. It really was that kind of, that even if it was an emotional response, the practice of pausing to actually look at the response rather than just doing it was part of our conversation.
I like that aspect, Joan. Thank you for that. That was good. And there's that, Sally and Alfredo, feel free to share from ours.
I think we all 3 were very much aligned that we would naturally place the personal, our situation was about visiting our partner, asking us to visit someone in the hospital with them, and we were invited by our team out for a drink. And we looked at the different circumstances of that. But we all 3 placed the meeting the partner to support someone in the hospital over the team unless there were all sorts of extenuating circumstances. And said maybe that's something we've learned over time.
And from our final group,
And Marie, please go ahead.
Yeah, we looked at how important the thing that was forgotten. It was the first one around, like you're rushing out the house and you forgot something. Do you go back or not? And so we looked at how important, like if you forgot the oven on, it would be something important enough to go back. Otherwise, we would progress forward. So it kind of depends on the nature. And then, what is our value on time? Like, do we value respecting other people's time, so therefore we need to be on time? Or, do we have lesser of a value on time? Yeah.
great. Thank you. What I have found is that when I make this kind of decision, this is what I think about. Do I make the decision simply to feel good? Is it achievement when it's, I have to do something in order to get ahead? Maybe it's revenue. I've got to generate some income. Or is it a problem solving? Do I have to clear the path so I can get something else done? Or do I just need to get out of the discomfort, to remove a distraction or avoid avoidance? So those are the things that I thought of as I thought about what is it when you have to choose the most important thing. Now there's one more. There it is. This is what I want to share with you. I mentioned before that the practices are not one for one to the characteristics of the resilient people that I met. And when I thought about it from my perspective, I saw silence, story, social, and selection all being supportive of this strong identity. Silence is where you're integrating your thinking. Story is where you're gathering your insights about yourself. The social is again the support that you need in order to feel that strength. And the selection is that you put yourself in uncomfortable places every single day, just to practice being able to do it. In-depth knowledge is more the story, the social, seeking certainly, and the selection. And insatiably curious is all about asking questions and making choices. So to me, this was the way in which I mapped the practices against the characteristics of very resilient people. Let me just pause there before I go to the last piece to see how this relates to how you can see this mapping. Does it make sense to you? Maybe I'll ask the question another way. Is there anything here that doesn't feel comfortable at all?
I'm curious around. I'm curious around the blank in the strong identity seeking. There, wouldn't that be also around like seeking to know more of thyself, or?
Yes,
Yeah.
I agree with you. I think that's true. Wow, I thought I didn't have one of these that was assisted by everything. Thank you, Anne Marie. Any other thoughts? Okay, I'm going to change it, Anne Marie. I can't change it in the book, but I can change it in my presentation. All right, let me stop sharing and get on with things.
Madeline, I asked this question in the chat a little bit, but I'm really interested in your research if that third, insatiable curiosity,
Mm-hmm.
if you saw an interrelationship between resilience related to age and insatiable curiosity. What I'm thinking there is that, you know, as children, we are fearless, usually, unless we don't reside in safe environments, and then that's different. But and as we get older, up into our 70s and 80s, we become more fearful generally. And how does that intersect with our ability to practice curiosity, and as a consequence, be less resilient in some ways?
Oh, that's a wonderful question, Joan. I'm thinking of the individuals who fell into this category. And they've spanned, I would say, the youngest was maybe 30. The oldest I know was in his close to 70. So from that perspective, it seemed to be not age related. But I think you make an interesting point about when you get into the really elder states, so to speak. One of the fears that you have is falling. You know your bones are more brittle, and so it's a real fear. However, that just means it's the physical piece. Can be very curious about all manner of things that you can read and explore. Where I find it really powerful is in social interactions, where if you are criticized or diminished from another person, the stronger that self-identity is, of course, the more you're able to stand forward, and it sort of rolls off you. And their age can be a real benefit. Does that get to what you're asking? Great, thank you. Thank you. There's another aspect that I want to just mention, and that is that I've called these practices, and I did that, and this goes back to one of the questions, how do I choose my words? And I do choose words carefully. The practice is all about doing something for the purpose of achieving something else. It's not for its own sake. You don't sit in silence so that you can sit in silence better. You do it so you're integrating in your mind or whatever. If you were going to go for a black belt, you would practice to get there, and yet you'd never stop practicing your moves. So the same way, the practices that I talk about are truly practices. They're not for their own sake. They're for the sake of building resilience in you. See, there was one more piece which I talk about in my book, and that is celebration. We so often forget that life is worthy to be celebrated. And so I do talk about celebration, even when it's a very simple thing. When I started doing the 5 minutes of silence every day, it was so painful for me to do that, because I'm not a person who sits. I move constantly. And so today, when I'm feeling like the 5 minutes, my alarm goes off and I'm not ready to stop, I go, oh yes, Madelyn, you're getting better at this. So that's a little moment of celebration. Sometimes it's when I get to the end of a speech and I've got 3 questions that I can ask. You know, that's a celebration that I'm getting better at really identifying the things that pique my curiosity. So I'm curious as to how you feel about celebration in our lives, and certainly in business. Oh my goodness, that's almost not heard of.
For me, celebration is so important. And I tend to resist celebration that is too ritualized. You know, that's like we always celebrate when we do X or Y, or we, you know, there's like more spontaneous celebration for job well done or recognition seems just wonderful. But the celebration that's like, we always have New Year's dinner like this in celebration, we always do Christmas like this, it becomes less of a celebration and more of a requirement. So I think that there's, what are we, there's a lot to think about how we celebrate. And, you know, moments of celebration that you mentioned, you know, that we've been silent, whatever, really appeals to me. Noticing what we want to celebrate. Yeah, it seems great to me.
Ellie, I think you're absolutely right. It's the aspect of noticing. This is a moment. I can be happy, whether I smile or go buy a coffee, a special coffee, or whatever. Yeah, spontaneous. So don't forget to celebrate. And in fact,
another word that comes to my mind, or a practice even, when you think of celebration and celebrating the small moments, the big moments, celebrating with each other, is the word gratitude. And I think it's being able to recognize the gratitude in that moment so that you can celebrate.
Yeah,
I think they're really tied together.
Oh yeah. Well, in fact, celebrate comes from the Latin celebrare, to go in great numbers. So it really implies that it's a public thing. But I think we can celebrate in private as well. But yeah, and gratitude is certainly a part of it. Okay, before I ask you my final question, I want to get back to the questions that you asked in the beginning. And one was from Alfredo: how do I approach life and work? And we actually talked about that in our small group, but I'll share it with the rest of you because I think, well, I don't know, maybe you're interested. I realized, and this was probably 20 or 30 years ago, I was out in the garden. I'm a gardener, and I was weeding, and I noticed how lovely the flowers were that year. And I sat back and I thought, you know, if I gardened for the rest of eternity, I would be content. And it was like a moment in my mind that said, this is what you're about, Madelyn. This is why you're here. And I realized that my job is to help people be who they are. If you're a tomato plant, you make good tomatoes. If you're a daisy, you make a beautiful daisy. And if you're a person, you are whatever. And that's very much what motivates me to write. It motivates me to speak. It motivates me to coach, do all the things I do. So thank you for that question. I always enjoy sharing that because not all of us have the opportunity to find that. And then the sharing is really exciting. I talked a little bit about the choice of words. I can't remember who asked that question. But I do think carefully about the words, and I'm not sure I can explain the choice of word. I do know I spend a lot of time in dictionaries, not thesauri, dictionaries, because I go back to root words, and I choose. That's the only thing I can say. And the other question was, the favorite part in writing the book was finding a wonderful editor. And it turned out that the editor that I found was 2 doors down from me in my neighborhood. And we've become fast friends, and she's a young woman. So that was the favorite part, because, you know, even when you're a good editor yourself, and I'm told I'm very good at that, but you can't see everything in your own work. So it was wonderful to have that. Okay, somebody asked about the 5 practices. I've talked about them, and the book, it goes into them much better, I think, and more fully. Now, this last question about the aspect, the interplay between the individual and the organization. remember my question or curiosity in doing this today was how you would translate the 5 practices into organizational practices. And I've told you one, which has to do with the silence and how do you bring the silence in. Any other thoughts about this? And it's good, we're doing excellent on time. I only have one other question I'm going to ask you at the end. Any thoughts? I will tell you that my next book is going to be that translation. So any ideas that you have, organizations you can direct me to who appear to be resilient, because I'm starting the interviewing process. Joan, you're off of mute, so maybe you wanted to say something.
Well, I'm always fascinated by the concept of resilient organizations, and particularly around the interrelationship between systemic kinds of discrimination in organizations and individuals' ability to be resilient and consequently participate in a resilient organization. I think some of the powerful systemic forces that are at play really impact an organizational resilience. And even though many of those play out for us as individuals, then we're making, kind of go back to the notion of choices, making choices about how we show up or feel safe inside the organization. And as a consequence, there's a gap between the organization and ourselves all the time. And I think in that space, organizational resilience can fail.
Mm.
Madelyn, do you think of a nation state as an organization? I've had this sort of conversation with people before, or an entity as large as, say, the Catholic Church as an organization. But the reason I'm asking, and I'm very interested in what you have to say, but I've never had more conversations ever with friends and colleagues who admit to feeling less resilient than they've ever been and bombarded by the things going on around us in our culture right now, and feeling despair. And I've never, we're upset about something, we're mad about something, we don't like something that happened in Congress, let's say. But this is big. And so I'm wondering how you think about resilience in such a huge frame. And maybe you haven't, and that's okay.
I have thought about it, but I haven't come up with answers, because you are right. I think this is the first, in my lifetime, this is the first time I have felt fear.
Yeah.
And that's very different. And it doesn't stop me at this point, but I have a grandson and I'm thinking about him. I'm saying, what can I do? So the answer is, I think there is such a thing as a culture is resilient or not.
Mm-hmm.
I think I would say probably culture, not a nation state so much.
Oh, that's a good distinction.
Yeah. 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 I'm going to have to think about that one, Sally.
Okay.
That's no, I have to do the organization first. I think I have to do that first. That's called focus. Yeah.
That's discipline as well.
Yes.
I wonder if it's Linda, and I wonder if I can make a comment on that issue of building culture of resilience, because I think with our Indigenous populations, particularly if we're looking at residential school survivorship, I think they've been working really, really strong and towards a culture of resilience. There can be lessons I think we might be able to learn from how they've done that and how they're working towards that. That's just a comment, because they have known great fear and great despair.
Yes. Thank you. Oh, that's marvelous. you know, I'm reading the book, no, it's not here. It's called Born a Crime. I don't think it is here. No, I left it. It's by Trevor Noah, and he's telling about his life in South Africa. And you're right, Linda. This was a man who was born into the space between two cultures. And reading his stuff is just amazingly insightful into my own culture. So yeah, thank you.
I just want to say thanks, Dawn, for putting our book in the chat. Talk about organizational, because it's about leadership, right? It's about leadership and the journey through daily practice of hope, despair, and forgiveness. And when Joan and I interviewed leaders, it was so many of them said, you can't talk about despair because you're not then considered a good leader and so on. So having exactly what we're doing now, having people get together to actually talk about those things that really challenge our resilience, and then how do we get back to hope, and how do we practice forgiveness? That was the other thing, is let's do it often for ourselves and for others. And so that I think these kinds of conversations are very valuable. I think certainly this has motivated me to be here this morning with you,
good,
Madelyn, because I think more and more conversations about the notions you're raising and so on, and how you take them into organizations for leaders and so on, is really, really important in the world right now.
Good, thank you. I agree. Well, I'm going to attempt to put a document. No, why isn't it going in? Wait a minute, maybe I can do it this way. No. I have a document that if you'll send me an email or something, I'll send it back to you. It's basically a series of 10 shows where I was interviewed on this topic, and you can go in and listen to them. That one is interesting because it was the final 10 interviews that I had. I've probably done 50 interviews on it. And it began to talk about things like resilience in children and that sort of kind of thing. And in fact, speaking of which, one of the things that I'm learning is that having a difficult childhood is not necessarily all bad. Not to say that we want to have children have difficult childhoods, but unless there's some pressure, they don't develop the resilience that they can have, the strength that they can have. And I always think of planting plants in flower pots. The last thing you do is you press the soil around the roots, because the roots only grow against pressure. And I think of that as kind of a metaphor for helping our children meet some pressure in their life that allows them to learn that they can make that choice. I think that children of helicopter parents are really disadvantaged because the parent is taking away all that moment when they can learn that they have the strength to do stuff. But I digress.
Madelyn, would you put your email in the chat so everybody has your...
Thank you. Thank you. Oops. But I have one more question to ask you. I've talked about 5 practices: silence, story, social, seeking, and selection. What's one of the practices that you think you might begin now?
I'll go first, oddly. I think one of the things that I will take away is a reminder to silence.
Thank you, Joan.
Mine would be selecting.
Aha, thank you, Anne-Marie. Linda, how about you?
Seeking.
Seeking, yes. That's my favorite. I admit it. Alfredo?
Yeah, I would say seeking as well.
Seeking, yeah. Okay. Sally, did we hear from you?
No, I think a deeper exploration of story for me.
Great. Jeannie, I think you do.
I just love them all. They're fabulous practices, so I'm just going to keep practicing.
Oh, wait.
Just keep doing it.
Just keep going at it, yeah. How about you, Dawn?
I think the deeper story, really paying attention to story and sharing story.
Yep, good. Well, I cannot thank you enough for this marvelous conversation. And if there's any more that you want to talk about, questions, whatever, we have 3 more minutes.
I'm curious more about the space in between.
Aunt Marie, I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
I'm curious more about the space in between.
The space in between, say more.
Well, you started with the stimulus and response and described about that space in between is truly where resilience lies. And that notion of having space in between, right? And spending more time in discovery, maybe that's where seeking lies. I'm not sure. I'm just having more curiosity about the space in between.
Well, it is an interesting space. You're absolutely right. Because oftentimes when you're hit with something that's tough, you get very emotional. And then your brain just shuts down because your amygdala is saying, get out of here. And so you have to recognize that and deal with the emotion. Then you can begin to process in that space. And to me, I just am always thoughtful of keeping myself in a place where if I have to make that choice, I have a space. It doesn't have to be instantaneous. Yeah.
And the work that I do on appreciative voice, one of the key pieces I'm working with is that space of when something happens and you're responding. And verbally, we can use our voices in many ways and directions, but taking a moment to not just react, and how the importance of holding, maybe even counting, sometimes if it's really rough to really count to yourself or something, but using that silence piece, but in the moment, in that space, to see how we might change an outcome.
Yes.
Or create an outcome or shift a direction.
Yeah.
And being very intentional about it.
Yeah.
And we're not very well trained in this.
No. Actually, Joan Rosenberg wrote a book called 90 Seconds to the Life You Love or something like that. And she talks about that space and that's the emotional, that's the space that you can shift your emotions. It's 90 seconds.
Mm-hmm. Great.
It's not long.
No.
It just feels long.
Yes. And sometimes it feels like, I heard Reese Witherspoon, so I always follow the most academic of people. That Reese Witherspoon was saying that a minute seems like nothing unless you're in plank pose, doing yoga. And I think of that in conversations now, that there are times when we're in a virtual plank pose and it seems like forever to make a response or to get it right or to move it in a direction. But so being in discomfort.
Good.
Well, I'm going to jump in here and thank you, Madelyn, so much for joining us today and sharing your book and your practices. And thank you everyone else for joining in and your participation and questions. And the next dialogue with the author is, what is the date? March. It's with Reinhard Stelter, and he has a book on coaching practices, appreciative coaching practices. So I hope you will join us for that. And that is March 18th. It's a Wednesday at 10 o'clock in the morning, New York time. So you can mark that in your calendar and be looking for the registration link for that call. And we're really excited to have Reinhardt here for that. So any other thoughts, questions before we sign off here? Gratitude to Madelyn.
Thank you.
Yeah. And thank you all for joining in. Have a beautiful day.
You too.